Hi everyone, this is your lecture for Chapter 5 for Motor Development. Chapter 5 is discussing the development and aging of specific body systems that impact motor ability and eventually human performance. So this particular chapter talks about the systems as specific individual structural constraints. Specifically, we're going to look at developmental changes in the skeletal, muscular, adipose, endocrine, and nervous systems over the lifespan. We'll note the interaction of the systems during development and aging. We'll discuss periods when rapid change in the systems make them particularly sensitive to external influences, and then we'll identify trends of increasing influence of external factors and decreasing influence of genetic factors as individuals proceed through the lifespan. And we study this to not only understand the average patterns of change that happens within each of these 5 systems, and again also to understand the range of individual variations within a system, which is kind of something we've mentioned before in chapters 1 through 4. So we're going to go ahead and start by talking about the rate limiting constraints that can be present if a given system has some sort of lag or developmental delay in growth. So any system that lags in develop can be defined as what we just talked about as a rate limiter. In other words, it's going to cause issues with further development. It might not be extremely obvious at first, but down the line it can definitely impact natural and normal or average growth. The first system we're going to jump into is the skeletal system and understand the early development. A lot of people think of the skeletism as a hard, definitive structure, and however, it is actually considered a living tissue, as well as undergoes considerable change over a lifespan, and really reflects the influence that both genetic and external factors has on the human body. Early in embryonic life, a skeletal system exists as this cartilage model of bones. Sites gradually appear in the cartilage model where bone is deposited, and these are called ossification centers. About 400 have appeared by birth, and another 400 appear after birth. The ossification that begins starts at primary centers in the mid portions of the long bones and then extends outward to the distal proximities. I can spit that out there. Especially in the mid portions of the long bones, like the humerus and the femur. And they begin to form bone cells starting at the fetal age of about 2 months. These bone shafts ossify outward in both directions from these primary centers until when birth is reached, the entire shafts are ossified. Postnatal bone growth in length occurs then at the secondary ossification centers that are located at the end of the bone shaft. These can also be considered the episioplates plates or the growth plate that some people refer to them to. This is a lot of times where you'll have uneducated coaches that will say weightlifting, will cause stunted growth in young athletes because it'll damage the episioplates plates, which is not true, not been supported by research. I just wanted to throw that out there because that's a myth that we commonly come across in exercise science. The episioplate plate has many cellular layers where the cartilage cells form, grow, align, and then finally erode to leave new bone in place. Bone is laid down then at the episioplates plates to increase the length of the bone. And the process of laying down new bone really depends on an adequate blood supply. Any injury that disturbs the blood supply threatens the bone's normal growth and length. In contrast to the long bones, small round bones, such as those in the wrist and the ankle, simply ossify from the center outward. While the long bones are growing in length, they also begin to increase in girth. This process is called appositional bone growth. Girth is increased by the addition of new tissue layers under the periosteum, a very thin outer covering of the bone, kind of like tree bark. There are also ephyses at the sites where the muscle tendons attach to the bones, and this is what we call traction ephyses. You might have heard of a similar condition or familiar condition that occurs during a growth period in some youth. It's called Osgood-Schlatters disease. It's an irritation of the traction epiphyses where the patellar tendon attaches to the shin just below the knee. Pediatricians usually have youth with this condition refrain from any sort of movement. It can be a hard injury to recover from because of the fact that it does require complete rest. Any sort of movement irritates the attachments, irritates the injury, and further aggravates it. And so overuse injuries to traction epiphyses during the growth period really can threaten the pain-free movement at this joint later in life. At about age 18 or 19, however, we have the cessation of bone growth. Specifically, the epiphyseal plate stops at different times for different bones. And we know that closure occurs at younger ages in girls. So this is the time then where we really think about our structure being built. And over the course of a human lifespan, then after this point specifically, but not only, we have this interaction between the osteoclast and the osteoblast to clean up any old or damaged part of the bone that needs to be kind of reabsorbed into the body, and then the osteoblasts that come through and repair and lay down kind of this fresh coating. So if you think about kind of the repaving of highways that we do very often in this country, where you have this fresh asphalt that comes in and is laid down, think of that as the osteoblasts, where they're replacing the old and damaged bone, and the osteoclasts come in and clean up the old repair. What happens is in older age, there becomes an imbalance between the cooperation between the osteoblasts and the osteoclasts. And if we're not very careful, especially with proper diet and proper exercise, we can have overactive osteoclasts that clean away the bone, causing the bone to be more brittle because less osteoblasts are active on the actual skeletal bone. And that's what's considered this bone remodeling throughout someone's lifespan. Old bone is absorbed while the new bone is formed by the osteoblasts. And so as we age then, this balance, this bone growth slows, and then it eventually fails to keep pace with the reabsorption process, thus creating the onset of osteopenia and eventually osteoporosis, again, if we are not with our diet and our physical activity, and regular checkups with our doctors as well. So truly the structure itself changes very little unless we have the onset of osteopenia eventually developing into osteoporosis. Osteoporosis can lead to conditions such as rib cage collapse, eventually then what is a result of stooped posture, and the end result of that then is reduced height. And extent of the bone loss is really, again, influenced by what we mentioned earlier, hormone levels, diet, and exercise. And a lot of the skeletal structure that's present in each adult depends a lot on what they did as a young individual. Research shows that children that participate in hopping, jumping, running, skipping, bounding, leaping, these impact forces that are present on their bone when they do those types of activities build strong bones, especially for later in life. So this is yet another indicator of why physical activity for our youth populations is so important. It's not just about being a healthy youth or a healthy individual at a young age. It's also about what are you preparing your body for as you age. How do we know how old our bones are? Because you know that with osteoporosis, osteopenia even, we can take x-rays of individuals' bones and see the extent of damage. And so they call that skeletal age. And what we can do is take x-rays, we compare them with standards for average skeletal development according to chronological age, and assess if there's any issues or an onset of possible osteopenia. If you look in your textbook, they also provide a great picture of the hand and wrist x-ray. You can see difference in the shading, and therefore professionals are able to quantify someone's chronological bone age and see if that matches up with their chronological age. And if not, then that's a great way to assess if we need to be changing physical activity, changing diet, as well as maybe considering having our hormones tested to see if there's any issues that could be affecting the interaction between the osteoblasts and the osteoclasts. And so here's that picture here. You can also check it out in your book. All right, so the first system, again, we talked about was the skeletal system, and now we're moving on, going over the muscular system. And a lot of the prenatal growth in the womb involves hyperplasia and hypertrophy. Remember, hyperplasia is that addition of number of muscle fibers, and I almost said it. Hypertrophy is the increasing of size of the cells. So once we are born, that postnatal growth mainly involves hypertrophy. And we've discussed that too in previous classes. I'm sure Coach Zeisloft has talked about the fact that in the only place that we've seen hyperplasia in regards to building muscle, it has been in animal studies. No human studies to date has shown that hyperplasia takes place. We cannot add continuous amounts of muscle fibers in order to have muscle gains and to increase, our force and power production in athletes. So that should be common knowledge for us. If it's not, now you know. Postnatal growth involves hypertrophy. And just very similar to what we've seen with previous graphs regarding height and weight, our muscle growth also follows a sigmoid pattern. So our muscles decrease in diameter. They also increase in length by the addition of sarcomeres. Remember, that's the functional unit of the muscle. We'll see that in just a second on the next slide. The differences between the sexes, muscle fibers becomes increasingly different in adolescence, especially in upper body musculature because of the hormones and the way that men versus women are built. Now, I will say this, and again, this is something I'm sure that you've heard before from Coach C. Men and women are composed of the same muscles. Females do not have different muscles than men. We are composed of the same. The reason that we have differences in our force and power production is markedly due to hormones. And women have the capability of building muscle just like men do, through appropriate training and programming, of course. So this picture should not be unfamiliar to you. This is the structure of the human muscle. And if you understand this picture, then it helps you to understand the sliding filament model. So you can see at the very bottom of the screen in the center, you can see the thick filament, which is the myosin heads that reach up to attach to the thin filament. And those kind of create the power stroke and causes the Z line on either side of the M line to contract and to pull together. And so that's a really, really quick explanation of the sliding filament model. That is the justification of how human muscles move, how we are able to have muscle movement. Again, a little bit of review from your previous classes. We know we have different muscle fiber types. The adult muscle is composed of either type 1, type 2A, 2X, and 2B fibers at birth. Surprisingly, about 15 to 20% of muscle fibers are undifferentiated. We can't quite tell you what their fiber type is. But then by age 1, the distribution of muscle fiber type is very similar to adult distributions. The exact proportion of muscle fiber type varies from individual to individual, and that's why we have people that are world-class sprinters like Usain Bolt, and then individuals like Michael Phelps, who are excellent endurance athletes in the pool. Their fiber types change very differently. But for the average adult who's not an elite level athlete, we have about a 50-50 split between type 1 and type 2A fibers. In regards to the muscular system and aging, most adults don't suffer a huge loss of muscle mass until they hit about age 50 when hormone levels drastically change. By 80, though, look at the difference. We have an average of about 30% of muscle mass is lost. And this occurs both in the number and the size of the muscle fibers. It really usually starts to onset after about age 70, is very prevalent and very obvious by age 80. Research tends to talk about the fact that as adults, we lose our type 2 fibers faster than we do type 1. And that initially makes sense because we think about old age in adults. Do we think about our grandma and grandpas being able to sprint to open the door when the doorbell rings? Not really. We typically think of older adults as moving very slowly. But there is some research out there that says we're not quite sure if it's due to type 1 or type 2. Now, I will say this again. There is a general decline of muscles in adults that comes with the aging process. However, diet and exercise can impact this greatly. And that's why you can see 70-year-olds, 80-year-olds even, running in marathons and participating in things like triathlons or even powerlifting competitions. You have a certain degree of choice, and I say that with air quotations, in the aging of your muscular system. The more active you are, if you follow the ACSM guidelines in regards to your cardiovascular health and your musculoskeletal health, you will suffer much less decline in muscle mass than the average sedentary individual. So we do need to address cardiac muscle because that is a type of muscle fiber type within the human body. As you can see, prenatally, our heart grows again by hyperplasia and hypertrophy. Postnatally, heart follows sigmoid growth pattern. That sounds familiar in regards to skeletal muscle. Heart and blood vessel size is appropriate for each developing age as they mature, especially for childhood and adolescence. The issue becomes when we reach old age, we can lose a lot of plasticity of the heart valves, and the heart muscle itself can become more fibrotic, which means it's more difficult for them to be able to perform their functions. Some of this does depend partly on lifestyle, however. In old age, the heart's ability to adapt to an increased workload declines. This might relate in part to the degeneration of the heart muscle, a degree in elasticity, and changes in the fibers of the heart valves. Again, the major blood vessels lose elasticity. Most changes in the heart muscles of individuals, again, are related to changes in lifestyle and resulting pathology rather than a simple aging of the cardiac muscle fibers. The next body system we're going to be discussing is the adipose system. A common misconception about adipose tissue, or fat, is that its presence in any amount is undesirable. In reality, adipose tissue plays a vital role in energy storage, insulation, as well as protection. The amount of adipose tissue increases early in life. It first appears in the fetus at 3.5 months and increases rapidly during the last 2 prenatal months. Despite this late prenatal increase, adipose tissue accounts for only about about 1 pound of body weight at birth. After a rapid increase of fat during the first 6 postnatal months, fat mass increases gradually until age 8 in boys and girls. In boys specifically, adipose tissue continues to increase gradually through adolescence, but girls actually experience a more dramatic increase. And as a result, adult women have more fat weight than adult men, and fat weight during growth increases by both hyperplasia and hypertrophy, but cell size does not increase significantly really until puberty. Individual fatness varies widely during infancy and early childhood. A fat baby doesn't necessarily become a fat child. After 7 to 8 years of age, though, it's more likely that individuals will maintain their relative fatness. And this is why an overweight 8-year-old has a high risk of becoming an overweight adult. Research has shown that individuals who are obese through the adolescent growth spurt, otherwise known as puberty, will remain obese as adults. So again, another reason why it's important to get our youth population up and physically active. So again, body fat distribution changes with our growth. Children have more internal rather than subcutaneous fat. And again, the subcutaneous fat, that's the adipose tissue that surrounds our distal limbs as opposed to our internal organs, really increases from the age of 6 or 7 years until the age of 12 or 13. And then subcutaneous fat then continues to increase in girls. Actually, let's go back because I wanted to make sure I addressed something before we talk about adult adipose tissue in adult populations. I did want to mention that this time during childhood and adolescence is an important time that probably deserves more research because of the impact that the adipose tissue has on the growing individual, specifically after puberty. There's a lot that we don't know about adipose tissue development and obesity. Researchers are currently examining many topics, including maternal weight gain during pregnancy, early infant feeding, as well as genetic factors. Of particular interest are 2 periods when the number of adipose cells increase. During the first 6 postnatal months, and then again, surprise, around that time of puberty. Increases in cell number are significant because once they are formed, adipose cells persist, even during malnutrition. That is, the cells may be empty of fat, but they still exist. And so that's why these 2 periods of the increase of cell numbers of fat, again, the 6 months after birth and during puberty, are critical in the control of obesity. Okay, so now moving on to adipose tissue in older adults. Both sexes tend to gain fat weight during early adult years, mostly due to changes in nutrition and activity level. It is not inevitable. It is something that is preventable with appropriate diet and exercise. The average American woman gains about 26 pounds, and the average American man gains about 18 pounds between the ages of 20 and 50. Total body weight begins to decline after age 50, but that's more because of a loss of bone and muscle as body fat continues to increase. And that's a dangerous combination, ladies and gentlemen. If we're losing body mass or body weight because of our bone mass is our bone mineral density is decreasing, and we have the onset of osteopenia or osteoporosis, or sarcopenia, then we have an issue with, it's an inverse relationship because the presence of a healthy bone impacts the presence of healthy muscle, which in turn can impact and mediate adipose tissue. But if we don't have healthy bone and if we don't have healthy muscle, then we tend to have that increase in adipose tissue. Moving on to the endocrine system then. The endocrine system has a lot to do with hormones. Hormones can get tricky, but let's keep it simple, let's keep it basic so that you can follow. The cells of a living being must be precisely regulated for their content and for their temperature. The control systems regulating the cells of the body are the nervous system and the endocrine system. So it's not surprising that they play a major role in growth and maturation. The endocrine system exerts its control over specific cellular functions through chemical substances we call hormones. Those secreted by the hypothalamus in the brain regulate the pituitary gland, which in turn regulates the adrenal gland, the thyroid gland, and the release of sex hormones otherwise known as the two gonadal hormones. The early development of the endocrine system is really a complex and delicate interaction between hormones, genes, nutrients, as well as environmental factors. Hormone levels really do need to be delicately balanced. Any offset of that balance can cause major implications for the human body. An excess or a deficiency can disturb a normal process of growth and development in the human body. We'll talk about how all three of those items, how hormones influence growth and maturation. And to be truthful with you, a detailed discussion of hormones is really beyond the scope of this text. There are entire classes that are dedicated to understanding and studying the impact of the endocrine system on the human body. So to keep it simple, to keep it short and brief, we need to understand, or the main thing that students need to understand is hormones stimulate protein anabolism, which is building, muscle building, or specific building, which results in retention of substances needed to build tissue. I guess that's a better way to refer to protein anabolism. The opposite of that, of course, is catabolism, which is the breaking down of tissue. As far as hormones go, there are also specific times in a growth period when one of these hormones can play a more critical role in growth. So we're going to talk about a couple of the hormones that play key factors in regards to things like insulin, growth hormone, and also hormones coming from the thyroid and gonadal hormones. Here's a picture of the location of the endocrine glands. You heard me say earlier that the hypothalamus communicates directly with the pituitary gland, which in turn then communicates and sends signals to the thyroid gland, which then impacts some of the gonadal hormones gonadal organs that have communications with the sex hormones. And again, this is all through the human bloodstream. It is chemical messengers that are sent through our blood to initiate or to cease a chemical response within the human body. The first hormone, the first anabolic hormone that we're going to be discussing right now is called growth hormone, and it's abbreviated in research texts and textbooks as GH. Growth hormone influences growth during childhood and adolescence by stimulating protein anabolism so that new tissue can be built. Makes sense, right? Growth hormone. Under the control of the central nervous system, growth hormone is secreted by the anterior pituitary gland. The body needs this hormone for normal growth after birth. Any deficiency or absence of growth hormone results in growth abnormalities, and even in some cases, the cessation of linear growth. I promised I'd keep it simple. The next anabolic hormone that we're going to discuss are hormones that come from the thyroid gland. Specifically, we've got thyroxine, we've got something called T3 and T4. These specific hormones are secreted by the thyroid gland, which are located in the anterior neck region. And these types of hormones influence whole body growth after birth, and another plays a role in the skeletal growth. So we have this thyroid stimulating hormone, or otherwise known as TSH. It regulates the thyroid hormones secreted by the thyroid gland. TSH then is in turn increased by a releasing factor found in the brain's hypothalamus. So you can tell how the hypothalamus in the brain acts in concert with the thyroid, or the pituitary thyroid system, and the nervous system together. And so this is an example of how our nervous system and our endocrine system work together. The third hormone, the third anabolic hormone, are gonadal hormones, and these affect growth as well as sexual maturation, particularly during adolescence, by stimulating development of the secondary sex characteristics as well as the sex organs. The androgens that come specifically from the testes that produces testosterone, and the androgens from the cortex of the adrenal glands hasten the fusion of epithelial growth plates in the bones. So these hormones also promote skeletal maturation at the expense of linear growth. This concept explains why early matures tend to be shorter in stature than later matures. Androgens also play a role in the adolescent growth spurt of muscle mass by increasing nitrogen retention in regards to protein synthesis. The spurt is more pronounced in young men than in young women because men secrete both testosterone and adrenal androgens, where women only produce the adrenal androgens. In women, the ovaries and the adrenal cortex secrete estrogen. Increased estrogen secretion during adolescence, as with androgens, speed the epithelial closure, but estrogen also promotes fat accumulation, primarily in the breasts and the hips. Men and women both have estrogen, they both have testosterone, but because of the presence of the differences between the male and the female bodies, they excrete these hormones in very different proportions. Another hormone that hasn't gone into really detail then is insulin. And this actually plays a major role in growth and development. Because it is produced in the pancreas, insulin is vital to carbohydrate metabolism, the stimulating the transport of glucose and amino acids through the membranes. Its presence also is necessary for full functioning of growth hormone. Any sort of deficiency in insulin can decrease protein synthesis and can be very detrimental at any time in life, but especially during growth. So I did want to mention that about insulin. As far as the endocrine system in older adults, earlier we kind of acknowledged that the nervous system and the endocrine system work in concert to regulate cellular functions and organ systems. And it's no surprise then that the continued functioning of these integrating systems is important to good health throughout a lifespan. In fact, there's a group of theories about causes of aging called gradual imbalance theories that suggest over time the nervous system, endocrine system, and immune system gradually fail to function. And that research was done in 2005 by Spirdusu, Francis, and McRae. And they go on to kind of explain that the gradual failure might occur at different rates in the three systems that will eventually lead to imbalances between them, and imbalances and reduced effectiveness within systems leave older individuals with an increased risk of disease. Interesting concept. Think about thyroid function as an example. Thyroid function tends to decline with aging, and disorders are more prevalent among older adults. Any sort of long-term increase in thyroid hormone levels can be related to congestive heart failure. So it's important, especially for older adults, to be screened for hyperthyroidism. And on the other hand, insufficiency of thyroid hormone, or hypothyroidism, is associated with the acceleration of aging systems. So you can see how important, just with that one example of thyroid functioning, that an appropriate balance of hormonal secretion is reached, because an increase or a decrease of the wrong amount causes issues on both ends. Gonadal hormone levels also decrease with age, and this is why some individuals, older individuals, seek hormone replacement therapy. For example, if an individual is prescribed androgen supplements, generally they see a difference in their muscle wasting and decrease in osteoporosis. We do need to do more research about the side effects of hormone replacement therapies. As a specific example, was evidenced by a finding done, or research that was done that found that women who receive hormone replacement therapy in menopause were at greater increased risk for some type of cancers. So there is more research that needs to be done on hormone replacement therapy. In regards to insulin levels, adults maintain secretion levels of insulin comparable to those of younger adults, but the incidence of type 2 diabetes increases markedly with age, and this is due to lifestyle factors. It is possible that older adults don't utilize insulin as effectively as older adults in order to promote that glycogen storage that eventually slows down the mobilization of fuel for exercise. But all of these examples show that gradual declines or imbalances between the nervous, the endocrine, and immune systems can lead to an increased risk of disabilities or diseases that then can both threaten good health and also serve as a constraint to physical activity. The final bodily system we're talking about tonight is in regards to the development of the nervous system. And no single system is as much the essence of an individual as the nervous system. We need only to observe an individual with severe brain injury to know this. Our nervous system controls movement, it controls speech, it is the site of thinking, analysis, memory, and its development is essential to social, cognitive, and motor development. So in regards to early development of the nervous system, much of neurological development occurs very early in our lifespan. The course of development is a prime example of the interplay of genetic and extrinsic factors. Genes direct the development of the nervous system structures and its main circuits. The trillions of finer connections between nervous system cells are fine-tuned also by extrinsic factors. So let's talk about that a little bit more in detail in regards to prenatal development. In general, the formation of immature neurons, which are the cells of the nervous system that receive and transmit information, and their differentiation into a general type and their migration into a final position in the nervous system occur prenatally. Neurons proliferate in the early prenatal period at an astonishing rate, to the tune of 250,000 per minute. As many, get this number, as many as 200 billion are formed. During the third and fourth prenatal months, almost all the neurons that an individual human brain will ever have are formed, although it seems that genes direct an overproduction of cells so that the system can later be pruned. And that research was done by Rady in 2001. Neurons contain a cell body, which carries out functions to keep the cell alive, up to 100,000 dendrites, which receive impulses from other neurons, and an axon, which transmit impulses to other neurons, glands, organs, or muscles. I thought we had a picture next, but we don't, so I'm going to back up again. Any new neurons that are formed travel to a final destination during a prenatal period. Some neurons form the brainstem, which controls heartbeat and breathing. Some go to the cerebellum, which controls posture. Some new neurons go to the cerebral cortex, where perception and thought take place. But generally, neurons are in their final location by the 6th prenatal month. And it's important to keep in mind that neurons specialize. For example, visual neurons are specialized as a function of both their genes and the location to which they migrate. In this case, a part of the brain where visual information arrives. And the migration process is vital to normal brain development. Once they're in place, they grow an axon along a chemical trail to a general destination in order to connect to other neurons, forming the brain's circuitry of about 100 trillion connections, otherwise known as a synapse. Keep in mind, however, though, that the migration of neurons and the branching of their processes are very susceptible to effects of environmental factors delivered via fetal nourishment system described in earlier chapters. There is growing evidence that some disorders like epilepsy, autism, dyslexia are caused in part by faulty migration of neurons. For example, nicotine that is introduced to a fetus by a mother smoking could affect migration. We know that children of mothers who smoked while pregnant are at increased risk for mental retardation. Alcohol that is introduced, if a mother drinks during her pregnancy, can also cause improper neuron migration. And babies with fetal alcohol syndrome are known to later exhibit lower IQs, as well as have more prevalent reading and mathematics disabilities than other children. There are many examples of fetal exposure to illicit drugs and toxins, and of malnutrition influencing the development of the nervous system. And so it is clear that the nervous system is one of the most susceptible systems to teratogenic exposure during the prenatal period. Late in the prenatal period, going back to kind of the early neural development, we have the neurons that begin to fire electrical impulses. And at first, because this is new, it's not something familiar, it's not something that the system has gone through before, the impulses are very random, and then eventually forming circuits with other neurons. And a lot to do with this is experience and practice. And playing a role in synaptic proliferation. In other words, if we learn to speak a language at a very young age, our systems will not prune those specific neurons because we use them. If you guys have heard the phrase use it or lose it, it's very true in regards to pruning of neurons. If we haven't learned to do certain things by a certain time, eventually that becomes pruned, and it becomes probably challenging to be able to learn certain skills after certain ages. But it is important to note that the neural network becomes more efficient with experience. That's why you also see maybe these commercials for brain games to keep you sharp and to keep your mind sharpened even at an older age. I don't know if you guys have seen, the software that's sold sometimes on television commercials. Buy a subscription and we'll put you get to choose what kind of games that you play, and it'll keep your mind quick and sharp, and you'll be learning new information. And that's based on the concept that the neural network can become inefficient if you aren't challenging it or learning new things. So at birth, when we talk about postnatal growth, at birth the brain is about 25% of its adult weight. And the growth rate of the brain increases rapidly after birth and then reaches about 80% of its adult weight by age 4. Then it enters a period of steady growth through adolescence. The rapid early growth reflects an increase in the size of the neurons, further branching to form synapses. And so the first postnatal year is one of the most prolific synaptic formation periods, and each neuron can establish anywhere from 1,000 to 100,000 connections. This rapid growth also continues to make neurological development very susceptible, again, to extrinsic factors. Poor nutrition, for example, could stunt growth of the brain, which is a deficit the individual may never recover from. Injury also, especially to the left side of the cerebral cortex, early in life leads to deficits in language ability. There's also increasing evidence that an infant's early life experiences influence development of the nervous system. We've got researchers in 1995 and 1996, all the way back to 93 and 92, who found that rats raised with much stimulation grew significantly more synapses in their brain than those raised without stimuli. And they believe that the same pattern holds true for humans. So learning is one of the most significant extrinsic factors that can influence postnatal development of the nervous system. And we now know that the brain restructures itself with learning. Isn't the human body amazing? We've got MRI documents that areas of the brain corresponding to frequently used body parts expand as the synaptic connections in those areas expand. And from early weeks of life and continuing over the lifespan, neural connections and pathways that are stimulated are strengthened, while those that are not used are weakened. The Genome Project has determined that 30 to 50,000 of the 100,000 genes in the human genome are designated for the brain. Even that number probably doesn't fully control our 100 trillion synapses. There is room for variation resulting from experience, and most of our traits reflect the interaction of genes and our environment. And here's the picture of the neuron that I was thinking was about to pop up earlier. So you can see here, this is our neuron structure. You can see how many dendrites actually really do come off of that neuron. There can be multiple dendrites that carry nerve impulses to the cell body, but only one axon that you see here actually emerges to carry an impulse to other neurons, glands, or muscles themselves. So you can see here the myelin sheath that covers the axon. If you've been in any of my classes before, you understand that with multiple sclerosis, when there's a breakdown or a degenerative state of the myelin sheath, that acts as a barrier to signal transmission. And so really one of the purposes of this myelin sheath that you see here is to act as kind of like a propulsion of the signal to the end of the branch. So think about the walkways in the airport, right? You could walk that whole way, and go the same slow speed, but at certain points in the airport, you can jump on that quick, horizontal moving escalator, and it's going to zip you faster, a little bit faster to get to that next terminal. So that's kind of my visual example of the function of the myelin sheath. But think about what happens when that myelin sheath or when that horizontal escalator is stopped or broken down. You can't get there as fast, right? So in the human body, when there's a breakdown of this myelin sheath, it slows the transmission of that signal. And a lot of times individuals with multiple sclerosis have very jerky movement patterns, and that's a reflection of the signal that's being sent from the neuron and its issue that it's being sent through these myelin sheath to reach the action potential to eventually be transmitted to the muscle itself. It's important to also address a little bit about the brain structure as it is a part of the nervous system. The spinal cord and our lower brain structures are more advanced at birth than are the higher brain structures. So our lower brain centers involved in vital tasks such as breathing and food intake are relatively mature. Lower brain centers also mediate many reflexes and reactions, and these automatic movement responses dominate the fetus and newborn's movements. So it makes sense that lower brain centers are relatively more advanced than higher brain centers at this particular time. The cerebral cortex gradually becomes more functional after birth. Myelination of axons allows faster conduction of neural impulses. That's something we talked about just a second ago with the picture. And the direction of the myelination tends to follow the direction of conduction. And that's important in conduction of the signal that's traveling. So what about the nervous system in older adults? Aging, again, as we've heard before with other systems, involves a decline in functioning. Specifically within the nervous system, we see a loss of neurons, we see a loss of dendrites, synapses are also lost, neurotransmitters, and myelin itself becomes not as effective. One particular theory of aging suggests that breaks in our neural network cause detours, and that's why there's a general slowing of cognitive functioning in older adults. However, research has shown that exercise can improve cognitive functioning. Yet another reason why we want individuals to be active in all stages of life. And so we've reached our summary and synthesis slides for our PowerPoint and for Chapter 5. And at this point, that concludes our lecture for Chapter 5.